When Triumph announced they were bringing back the Daytona, I could not have been more excited. It's a legendary namesake, and I knew the Triumph would do something cool with it. But I kept my expectations a little bit low because I had a feeling it would compete in this new, not-so-super sport category. And here it is in the flesh, the new Daytona 660. And I gotta admit, I'm a little conflicted about this motorcycle. Let me explain. As many of you know, I am a Daytona 675 aficionado. I've owned 4 different 675Rs. I've ridden them on street, tracked them, raced them, modified them, and lovingly maintained them. They are quite literally my favorite sport bikes of all time. And when I found out that the model was being discontinued in 2017, I really got quite sad. And sure, they made that limited edition Moto 2 Daytona for a while, but really for me, that was a street triple with carbon fairings. It didn't have the same je ne sais quoi that a 675R has. When I saw this motorcycle in person, I was quite literally overcome with emotion. A brand new white Daytona, just like the one I used to have, for a new generation of riders, that really made me so excited. But then I started feeling sad because it's nothing like an old Daytona. It's a little softer, it doesn't make as much power, it doesn't rev as high. But then logically, I said, well, yeah, they're gonna sell a boatload of these things, and Triumph entered this market at just the right time with a really well-priced motorcycle. And that's when it hit me. In order to properly review the Daytona 660, I need to give you 2 reviews in one video. An emotional review and a logical review. Eurocycle sent me this bike to tool around with, by the way, so I'm gonna give you a breakdown later on the video why you should buy a bike from them from an emotional and a logical perspective. Let's rip off the Band-Aid and start the emotional review of this motorcycle for those of us who mourn the loss of the super sport motorcycle. This is a travesty. They're serving you up slop and they expect you to eat it. Come everybody, come, look everybody, we made a 660cc 3-cylinder engine make 95 horsepower. Oh my God, everybody come, look how great, look how everyday usable it is. We think that our customer base has a 62 IQ and is never even gonna question the fact that this is a cheap masquerading naked bike that wants to be a sport bike. I can't believe Triumph had the audacity to name this a Daytona. Almost 20 years ago, back in 2006, Triumph could make a 675cc engine that made 117 horsepower. I'm so tired of these bikes, man. The Me Too sport bikes, the everyday usable, the not so super sport. We are regressing as a species, folks. Look, you can soup up your V6 Mustang all you want. You can add as many spoilers as you want to your GTI. It will never be a 911. It will never be a Corvette. So please stop trying to make naked bikes into sport bikes. And please stop trying to sell me a bike that's great at commuting and good at nothing else. Let's make real sport bikes, okay? Let's take a closer look, shall we? Here we have the same triple-cylinder mill from the Triumph Trident, albeit hopped up a little bit. This thing makes 95 horsepower at 11,250 RPM and 51 foot-pounds of torque at 8,250 RPM. Are you impressed? You're supposed to be impressed. That should really impress you. Triumph did fit some go-fast parts inside of this engine to make it a little bit spicier, but I wanted to point out the most egregious thing on this motorcycle. That right there. That is a plastic cover that they put over the steel tubular frame to make it look like a super sport. You just can't make this shit up, folks. The Daytona 660 utilizes the same frame as the Triumph Trident with a couple geometry tweaks a la Yamaha's R7 to make it a little bit more sporty. It's functionally a naked bike with plastics. The other thing is, to my ear, this doesn't sound like a Daytona. You take a listen and let me know what you think. No, it doesn't. Nope, that ain't it. The 675 platform, especially in the Daytona, was a raucous, hopped up, high revving engine. It had had these loud, whiny, straight-cut gears on the balancer shafts, giving it that distinct whistle that the 675 had. Combine that with the incredible intake howl from the ram air intake system on the old 675s, and you had a motorcycle that is a far cry from what this thing is. And best part of all, the 675 in the Daytona revved to 14,400 RPM. The Daytona 660 is missing that spicy character and charm. Combine that with a really tight gearbox that doesn't really allow this thing to stretch its legs, and you can tell it's a naked bike with plastics. It simply doesn't build revs and power in the way that a traditional sport bike would. It's got meaty accessible torque in the middle, but that's not why we ride sport bikes. There's a little bit of a top end rush, but it's nothing to write home about. Triumph made this into the limp-wristed sport bike it needs to be to satisfy the chronically online Zoomers who apparently can't handle more than 100 horsepower. So when we swing a leg on this machine, we notice it's closer to a rented mule than a thoroughbred horse. The look out of the cockpit here is also just a little bit sad. I remember my 2014 675R. It had carbon fiber inlaid inside of the fairings. The Olins had these blue caps on them. The triple tree was beautifully cut and machined. The tachometer was this beautiful red sweeping needle. It was just a thing of beauty. But this motorcycle, it's a little cheap feeling. It's got pseudo carbon fiber plastic, the cheap little dash unit you get from the Triumph Trident, some pretty budget looking controls all around that to me doesn't really feel like a Triumph. The old Daytona had a little bit of Porsche GT3 about it. This thing kinda Honda Civic-like. It's comfortable enough to sit, but not as comfortable as an upright naked bike, and not as fully committed as a sport bike, so you kinda get this thing that's not really good at either one of those. It's a compromise, and one that kinda fails in my opinion. Stylistically, this motorcycle resembles the old Daytona, but it kinda feels like an uncanny valley AI version of a Daytona. Look, we can all agree that the first generation 675 was one of the most beautiful sport bikes ever made. It had that aggressive prowler-like stance, the undertail exhaust, the small svelte qualities about it. You can't deny it, it was a gorgeous machine. It's also aged beautifully, such that nearly 20 years later, to my eye, it still looks just as good as the day it rolled on showroom floors. This model, it has the weird stumpy end from the Triumph Trident, and it sits a little bit different, and the nose is a little too stumpy for my taste. It doesn't look quite right to my eye. The quick shifter is optional on this machine, which I think is a crying shame. One of the greatest things about the 675 was opening the throttle, feeling that snickety Triumph gearbox, and blipping it up through the gears using the quick shifter. But enough blabbing, let's go take this thing out for a ride and see if it can even come close to living up to the name that's on the fairings.
If ever there was a time to point out that we are going backwards as a species, it's with this new Daytona 660, man. So the flick-in is really slow. You don't have that proper sport bike feel with it at all. It doesn't feel like it's gonna help you carve any corners. It feels like it's actually getting in its own way. You guys ever driven a Honda Civic with like a performance pack or something like that? Or maybe a hopped up V6 Mustang? That's how this feels, you know? You can tell that the engineers were trying to give something that feels really sporty and fun, but ultimately, you're starting off with something that just is a little compromise from the factory, right? Like, it doesn't feel like a Daytona. The look out of the cockpit is so cheap feeling, man. The ABS is also very intrusive on this bike. You know, it's a sport bike, so you're supposed to carve corners and trail brake deep with it, and once you really press on the brake lever, you get vibration pretty much immediately. Like, it's not fun to have a motorcycle that's supposed to have sporting intentions, but it ultimately doesn't really come across, you know? Like right there, I stepped on the brakes a little bit, and you just get pumping, you know, from that front lever. Yeah, it holds a line, but a Daytona? No. The shape of the gas tank too. The Daytona 675, the old one, had a beautiful, you know, wide, flat gas tank because you were meant to, you know, get in the pocket and sit in the perch of it, right? Like this. But this bike, it's just a hopped up street bike, so it doesn't really feel like you're meant to get in the pocket and really attack with this thing. And I think the gearing, since it's based on a naked bike, doesn't really lend this bike any favors, honestly. If you're trying to build a sport bike, you know, you want nice long gears so you can really feel that power band. Although this thing can rev to a little over 12,000 RPM, it doesn't feel good doing it, you know? It feels rough. It feels like it's out of breath. It feels like it's like really struggling to do what it's being asked to do. And that's what happens when you take a platform that wasn't really designed to do this and make it do it, right? Reminds me a lot of the R7. You know, the R7 is a good motorcycle. Like this thing's fine. It's a good motorcycle, but you know, to give it that name and to make it so that people think that it's that kind of bike, it's just simply not, you know? It's just simply not that sort of machine. And I find it to be very buzzy too. I've been riding this bike around for a while now, and you know, at higher revs, higher speeds, there's a really nasty vibration in the bars. I normally don't even notice stuff like that on motorcycles because, guess what, you're on a bike, it's supposed to be a little raw and visceral. But this bike, you know, you really get the sense that it's quite buzzy, quite vibrational. And yeah, we're regressing as a species. I don't know what to tell you guys. Like, I've had younger people talk to me about motorcycling, and you know, I hate to tell them, but I'm like, yeah, dude, it was better back, you know, in the mid 2010s, early 2000s, late 2000s. Like, it just simply was better. Bikes were seemingly built better. They were, you know, higher performance, no compromises, and it makes me sad. It makes me sad riding this bike. It just makes me sad. I don't care about the specs. I don't care about, you know, its place in the market, this and that. It makes me sad knowing that people are going to ride a Daytona, and this is the Daytona. This absolutely should not be called a Daytona. This is a Sprint 660, a Trident 660 RR. This is not a Daytona, dude. And it doesn't have that raw sport bike feel, because it's not designed to have it, and it never can have it. And this is what I tell you guys, that you can't take a regular old little, you know, sport bike like an SV650, a Triumph Trident, whatever, MT-07. You can spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort trying to make it into a true blue sport bike. And you can get close, you can get okay, but fundamentally, the frame and the engine aren't there. And those are the two most important things. You can tweak geometry, you can change angle, you can add better suspension, whatever the hell. But you're missing the fundamental components that make a sport bike a sport bike. A beautiful, willing, high-revving engine that has a sonorous character, the quality, the fit and finish, a frame that has tons of lateral rigidity, that's stiff, that's dialed in, you know? Ergonomics that feel like you're supposed to ride it like a sport bike, you know? This is a bit of a bastardization of a Daytona, and I'm sad. I am sad about it. It doesn't make me happy to report this to you guys.
Look, when you're making an emotional decision like buying some top shelf Ducati or a crazy BMW adventure bike, the logical thing to do is to go to Eurocycle and get their preferred pricing. They're gonna be any dealership that you come up against. And best part of all, they'll ship anywhere in the nation. I've bought tons of motorcycles from them. It shows up in a giant delivery truck with a professional service, and it's no different than buying at the dealership. Whether you're in market for a brand new Triumph like this Daytona 660 or a full Zoot Ducati Street Fighter V4S, Eurocycle's got you covered with everything in between. They've got over 200 used bikes in stock right now, and like I said, they'll be anybody's pricing, so go and check them out in the link in the description below. They support your sweet Papa Yam with cool owner bikes like this, so go and check them out. Wow, Somehow in the morass of everyday parallel twin motorcycles, Triumph found a way to make a 3-cylinder sport bike that has an MSRP of $91.95. That's pretty darn impressive and is probably going to be a shot across the bow to everyone else making these not so super sport bikes right now. Since Triumph isn't worried about putting this thing on the racetrack, they were able to make some pretty smart and efficient cost-effective measures, and they passed that back onto you. Even better, this motorcycle isn't going to be punishing to ride and it's everyday comfortable but sporty enough to where you can actually have some fun with it. Let's take a closer look at what makes this bike a little bit different than everything else in the category. At the beating heart of the Daytona 660 is a 3-cylinder engine borrowed from the Triumph Trident. Now, I say borrowed because Triumph actually did some really cool hot rodding to this engine to make it pretty different from the Triumph Trident. Yamaha could definitely pick up some pointers because they pretty much just plug and play their MT-07 engine right into the R7 with no changes. This engine has a new crankshaft, new wrist pins and pistons, a new cylinder head with larger exhaust valves, and a different exhaust cam that provides more lift than the unit in the Trident. And they also replaced the Trident's single throttle body with 3 44mm units and a larger airbox. And at the end, you have an exhaust system that's a little bit revised over the Triumph Trident, and to be honest, it kind of looks like the Daytona 675 exhaust, which is pretty cool. These changes create an engine that's way zestier than the Triumph Trident, producing power at 12,500 RPM, which is a 17% increase over the Triumph Trident. These changes add up to an engine that revs much higher with a redline of 12,500, which is pretty darn zesty for a not so super sport machine. Peak power is 95 and peak torque is 51, and that torque is accessible all the way through the mid-range. It actually has 17% more peak horsepower than its Triumph Trident brother. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, feel those revs.
The Daytona 660 has a slightly longer wheelbase than the Triumph Trident and a little bit more aggressive front end, meaning that it should be a little bit more stable on those long sweeping corners and flick in a little bit more aggressively than the Triumph Trident. Swinging a leg over the new Daytona 660, and you can immediately tell this is way more approachable than those old super sports used to be. The reach to the bars is really nice, and it's honestly all day comfortable. You can ride this bike for a nice 200-300 miles in a day and have a blast. You don't feel like you have to be some 130-pound Spaniard or Italian named Marco to ride the motorcycle. Now, I'll be honest, you can tell the cockpit was built to a budget, but it's perfectly in line within this category, and of course it's going to share parts with the Triumph Trident. I think the Daytona 660's done a pretty good job of trying to differentiate itself a little bit from the Triumph Trident. The triple tree looks a little different, the switch clusters are similar but a little different, and this kind of fake carbon inlay that they have going on here, while a little chintzy, it does look good for the category. And while I'm not a huge fan of Triumph's split screen TFT display, I do think it displays the information very well. The Daytona 660 uses a relatively pedestrian front suspension, the Showa SFFBP, that's separate function fork big piston. No adjustability at the front, but it's damped pretty well from the factory. Out back, you have a Showa monoshock that's preload adjustable only, and actually I had to dial in a little bit of extra preload to get the sag correct for this machine, which is pretty rare for a stock motorcycle. The Daytona 660 also comes equipped from the factory with the Michelin Pilot Road 6 tire, which I think is an awesome fit for this machine. You're not gonna have to burn out the OEM tires and immediately get something up spec. These will easily last 10,000 miles. I put them to 34 PSI front and rear before you guys see my test ride. This bike does weigh 443 pounds, which does make it a little bit more portly than the R7 and the RS660 in that twins bike category, but puts it right in line with the GSX-8R and CBR 650R, which is really what this motorcycle competes against. With a 31.9-inch seat height, smaller riders may find this a little bit intimidating, but honestly, it's pretty narrow through the gas tank, and with that 443-pound curb weight, it shouldn't be that bad for even riders at 5'5" or a little bit above that. I'm about 5'11" with a 32-inch inseam, and I can comfortably flat-foot this machine. But enough blabbing, let's get this thing out on the road.
Well, a 3-cylinder, fully fared sport bike in this category is a bit of a revelation, isn't it? Now, you know, looking at the RS660 and the R7, I think this motorcycle gives up the ghost a little bit because, you know, it's a little bit heavier. It's not quite as agile as a twins bike. You know, you got a bigger crankshaft, and so that's going to make this thing a little bit more of a gentleman sport touring bike, like the GSX-8R or the CBR 650R. And I really think that's where it's competing against, right? The larger multi-cylinder bikes, not really the R7 or the RS660. And the componentry here is pretty good. The braking feel, while you do get a little bit of pump of ABS for some reason pretty early on the pull of the lever for some reason, you know, you do have really nice feel to the lever for a stock master cylinder, especially something that's been built down to a price like this. And man, price is really important nowadays. As everyone knows, the prices of everything have gotten a little bit out of control. And so this machine at $91.95 it's really impressive, honestly. Okay, I'll give you guys some context. A brand new 675R back in 2017, excuse me, 7 years ago, was $14,000. That was the MSRP. Adjusted for inflation, because we have to do that because y'all know what's been happening in the past couple of years, it's $18,000 in 2024 dollars. So this Daytona 660 is literally half the price, thereabouts, you know, plus $195 of an old Daytona 675. Is it half the bike? I wouldn't say so. It makes almost 100 horsepower. It's a little bit more usable and friendly to ride every day. And I really think that's a pretty cool thing that this bike does, you know? I like the fact that it's a little bit more livable, a little bit more normal. You know, the Daytona 675 felt like this really bespoke, special bike. It was definitely a special bike. The Daytona 660 feels much more appropriate for your kind of second motorcycle, your step-up bike. The build quality here and the general vibe is actually very similar to Yamaha, very similar to a Japanese bike, in that it's just a little bit more simple, you know? And if that's what it takes to lower the cost, then I'm all for it, you know? I love the fact that we're at a point now where beginners and intermediate riders can get into a machine that has 3 cylinders, almost 100 horsepower for under $10,000 in 2024. And this bike represents an awesome progression of power in Triumph's lineup. You know, you start on a Speed 400, you get into a Trident 660 or Daytona 660, then you upgrade to a Street Triple, then you upgrade to a Speed 1200, you know, or a Speed Triple 1200 rather. And that's pretty cool. It's cool that these bikes have carved their way into the market, and I think the market is responding, given the fact that so many manufacturers are making so many of these bikes. You know, I think people are really excited about this category. I think this is a bike that performs very, very well for what it is. You know, you can't compare it to the old Daytona because it's not an old Daytona, and we have to understand this motorcycle is something new, right? And that's why it's a little confusing that they called it a Daytona, because I don't think this bike is a Daytona, because it's trying to be something else. And what it does very well is being that something else, you know? I think this bike really excels as its own thing. It's geared a little tight for my liking. You know, it doesn't really feel like a sport bike because the gearing is just really damn short and really tight, because it's more of a naked bike, right? It's got that immediate accessible torque of a naked bike. It doesn't have that building kind of revs that, you know, a proper sport bike has. And so I think that the fact that Triumph was able to hot rod the engine a little bit and keep the price as low as they did is pretty cool. I mean, this thing will walk an R7 in a straight line all day long. It's got way more punch at the top end. I think this thing makes 20 more horsepower than an R7. And that's nothing to scoff at. You know, even with its weight deficit of about 40 pounds, it punches pretty damn good, you know? Drop it down 2 gears into this corner. Pick it up a little bit. It's got a nice honk to it, you know? It's got a nice sound. It's definitely a 3-cylinder. I think it's really nice. Compared to the parallel twins that we have dominating this category, this and the CBR 650R are the only things that have, you know, proper multi-cylinder engines. No more of these parallel twins, and I think we have to applaud Triumph for doing that, you know? I think we really have to tell Triumph, hey, good job putting a 3-cylinder out there rather than putting out a, you know, parallel twin. They could have easily developed a parallel twin platform and called it a day and just did the same thing as everybody else, but they didn't, you know? They put a 3-cylinder in it because that's what they do, and that's pretty cool. There's something special about 3 and 4-cylinder engines, the parallel twins. You can put the 270-degree cranks on. This has a bit of a unique quality to it, and you know, if you're considering bikes in this category, really ride them back to back because they are very different. You know, the R7 is very sharp, very pointed, very aggressive ergonomically. The RS660, I think, is just the knockout hit of the category, but it is expensive, right? It's like $3,000 more than this Daytona 660. That's a lot of money, right? The GSX-8R is the most well-rounded, gentlemanly of all of them, right? I think it just does everything pretty good, but it lacks character in my opinion. And then the Honda CBR 650R, well, it's the only 4-cylinder, it's a Honda, so if that's your bag, then that's the one you're gonna get. But I really don't think that it does anything substantially better or different than this Daytona 660, and I actually think the Daytona's got a little bit more pop and flavor to it. It's a very well executed package, you know. It's a little cheap, it's a little not so nice around some of the edges, but for the design brief that the Triumph kind of gave itself to build this not so super sport thing with a 3-cylinder engine under $10,000, I think it's a great bike. They really knocked it out of the park, and it works really well as an everyday bike. And that's something you couldn't say about the Daytona 675R. You couldn't say that motorcycle, you know, performed great as a city bike. I had one as a city bike, and I'd much rather be on this Daytona 660 if I was going to commute around town and kind of, you know, use this as an everyday bike.
Logic and emotion are typically at odds with each other. We think about what the heart wants versus what the brain knows it needs, and they're usually polar opposites. If we all made completely rational, logical motorcycle purchase decisions, we would all ride white Versys 650s with hard luggage and stock exhausts. And I don't know about you, but that's not a world I want to live in. Motorcycling is way more emotional than we care to admit. The feeling that a bike gives us, the look-back factor, the sound it makes, the way it goes down the road, all that contributes to the special feeling that we get on two wheels. Look, I desperately wanted Triumph to name this thing something different. A Sprint 660, a Triumph Trident 660 RR, anything but a Daytona. I would have so much less baggage. I wouldn't be as irrationally angry that this thing is called a Daytona and kinda looks like a Daytona. If it was called something else, I don't think I'd have any of those feelings. I would simply look at this bike and think of it as the competent, value-driven, good motorcycle that it is. It perfectly meets the moment that motorcycling is having right now. Bikes are becoming cheaper, simpler, softer, more fun, and more accessible for the beginner and intermediate rider. We've seen time and time again that the sales figures for super sports just simply don't add up for anybody to really build them. Bikes are also becoming cross-platformed, more homogeneous, less special, and in that world, I actually really do have to give Triumph credit where credit's due. They built a 3-cylinder sport bike for the masses. Not some watered down parallel twin or some stupid detuned inline 4. This is a 3-cylinder and it's really unique. But I cannot say that this Daytona gives me any of the feelings that a Daytona 675 ever did. It's not as focused, it's not as exciting to ride, and it certainly doesn't feel as special. I've never mourned the loss of the 600 class bike as much as I do today riding this Daytona 660. I remember what it felt like to ride my 675 when I first got it back in 2015, and I'm literally getting goosebumps right now thinking about it. Maybe it's because it was my first big bike, and maybe that's why it's so special to me, but cruising with my Daytona 675 late at night on a highway, opening it up, are some of the most treasured memories of my life. 600 class Supersports will always feel really special to me, regardless of how little sense that they make for on-road riding. I can understand why this bike was built. I can even understand why it was called a Daytona. It was a smart marketing move. It's a solid machine that competes really well in the category it was built for. But to me, can't sign off on it. It's tough seeing the name of something you love so dearly put on a product that simply doesn't align with what it used to be. Look, this is a cool bike, priced really well with a unique engine in the category. It's a logical choice for those of you in market for this type of motorcycle, and if you don't have any baggage around this particular badge, then maybe it's okay. But emotionally, It's just as cold as all the other parallel twin, not so super sport bikes in this category. Thanks for watching today's review, and a big shout out to Eurocycle once again for letting me borrow this bike and make a review. Go and check them out in the link in the description below. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later. That's all, folks. That's the end of the video. Our time is up, but if you want the conversation to keep going, join me over on yammynoob.co. Become a member. You'll gain access to our infamous Discord server. I'm on there every day, so if you want to talk to me, ask me some questions, just shoot the BS about motorcycles. That's the best way to do it, and you'll get entered to win this MT-09 SP. This is one of my favorite giveaway bikes we've done, and I would hate for you to miss out on it. But if you need a little bit of time to think about it, click the link right over here. Keep watching yourself some Yammy Noob. We have tons of premier, top tier, incredible motorcycle videos just waiting for you. They're free. Watch them.